Welcome. I'm Sean Kay. I chair the International Studies program here, if you don't know me. And I'm very, very excited always to welcome important guest speakers here to campus. But I'm particularly excited tonight for two reasons. One is that this is our annual Corinne Lyman Lecture, of which our guest speaker was a student just like you during our first one some time ago when Steve Walt came and inaugurated this series, which has become well known as a series where either accomplished or rising scholars come to present some of their research that has professional implications for the world, right? And so we've really made this series very much reflective of that. And the purpose of the series is to celebrate also the legacy of my predecessor, Corinne Lyman. And Corinne was here for many decades, has many generations of students that are making a huge, huge difference in the world. And because of her being around here and taking advantage of that, I chose to create this series in honor of her name and celebrate her so that she could hear how much we appreciate the legacy that she contributed to this university. And I can tell you, I try to walk behind or alongside her as fast as I can in her shoes every day, and it's hard. So thank you, Corinne. Thank you very, very much. So, also very quickly, we had a changeover in regime over the summer. And so many of you over the years may have heard me thank Pam Locker, our assistant. And Pam has some tangles in this event too, because she helped with the preparation. But we also have a new administrative assistant in our program now named Lee Ann Emmons. And I encourage you to come by Elliott Hall and make her feel very welcome as part of our family here at Ohio Wesleyan. Okay, so now on to the interesting, important stuff for our speaker. The other reason I'm excited to do this tonight is because I'm introducing to you a former student. And that is really cool. And we've done that a few talks recently. And I'm particularly proud of Sahar. I remember her very well when she was here. I didn't realize until tonight that she was a triple major here at Ohio Wesleyan. I've only known a couple that have pulled off that hat trick. And to do it with a very high GPA also. She majored in international studies, politics and government, and economics. So that's one note to self. Lots of majors might help out. And she left while she was here. I brought Sahar on as my research assistant, and so those of you who've ever seen my global issues book, global security book. Sorry, I should remember the title of my own book. She was the key to putting that whole thing together, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And in fact, she came out of here and we co-authored articles for a peer-reviewed journal. She helped me with a research project for the Defense Department on higher education and liberal arts and how they contributed to thinking outside the box in terms of military culture and things like that. And she then left here and went to University of Chicago for a master's degree in public policy, where she studied with people like John Mearsheimer and Charles Lipson and others, who are some of the most prominent people in our field. And from there, she went to get her Ph.D. at the University of California at Irvine. During all that time, she also added being associate editor of Washington Quarterly, one of the most important policy journals in the country. She also worked while she was here as an intern in the U.S. Department of Defense at the National Defense University. And she has situated herself now at the Cato Institute, which is one of the most prominent and well-known think tanks in Washington, D.C. Sahar Khan is established herself, and I can vouch for this because I go to conferences in different parts of America, and I look and I see Sahar in a corner sort of holding court with all these really famous, international relations experts, and they're all asking her about Pakistan, right? Like, she's the go-to person. And she really has carved out a niche as an expert in militancy, in counterterrorism policies, anti-terrorism legal regimes, South Asia, Middle East, and U.S. national security. If you followed anything since 9/11, you know that most experts that look at terrorism consider Pakistan to be, if not one of the key nexuses of challenge, right? And so we're going to hear about that tonight. Sahar is going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less or thereabouts. We'll have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A, a little bit longer maybe. We should wrap up here by about 20 past 8 or a little bit, because I know everyone's busy and they have things to do. So we'll keep it crisp. I will join her for some moderated Q&A after the main talk. And that's enough for me. I think we should hear from Sahar Khan. So.
Well, thank you, everybody. First, can everybody hear me in the back? Is that good? I can't begin to explain what a pleasure it is to be here. As Dr. K mentioned, I was here when the first Korean Lyman lecture began, and to now be a part of the lecture series, it's very special. And Ohio Wesleyan has always had a special place in my heart. So for that, I thank you, OWU, for my college years. And especially thank you to the Department of Politics and Government and to Professor Sean Kay, who has over these years not only been a mentor, but has also become a friend. And so for that, thank you very much. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Pakistan. And for those of us some of us at least, who have been following South Asian policy or US foreign policy in South Asia, we know that things under the Trump administration have declined a little. President Trump began 2018 with a tweet about Pakistan. He said, "The United States has foolishly given Pakistan more than $33 billion in aid over the last 15 years. And they have given us nothing but lies and deceit, thinking of our leaders as fools. They give safe haven to the terrorists we hunt in Afghanistan with little help. No more." Now, the Pakistani government reacted very swiftly. The foreign minister at the time went to Twitter, because that seems to be the go-to apparently now for everybody. But he went to Twitter, and he basically said that the United States and the Trump administration was undermining the bilateral relationship between the two countries. The Ministry of Defense of Pakistan said that the US is undermining all the things that Pakistan has done for the US in Afghanistan, and in fact, it is Pakistan who suffers from terrorism, and the US tends to overlook all of those safe havens that exist in Afghanistan that attack Pakistani citizens themselves, right? So I think from all of this, it seems that Pakistan is one of these countries that somehow sponsors militant groups, is solely responsible for terrorism or militancy in South Asia, and perhaps even beyond, which I think might be a gross exaggeration. And Pakistani governments, especially the current one, has been very passionate about saying that they do not sponsor militant groups. And in fact, Imran Khan, who's the current prime minister, very openly said that militant groups do not belong in Pakistan. And in fact, Pakistan has gone after militant groups through their various counterinsurgency campaigns that they have been waging since 2009. But they have gone after these militant groups at great cost to the Pakistani state and to the Pakistani people, right? Now, in addition to sort of what is going on between the United States and Pakistan, sort of in the bilateral realm, there's a bigger overarching issue, which is the US war in Afghanistan, which is now the longest war that the United States has been involved in, right? Now, the US war in Afghanistan, as you all know, began after 9/11, and Pakistan partnered with the United States in this. And for the past 18 years, there's been a back and forth. And there's always been this call, should we end the war, should we not end the war? Now, President Trump, during his campaign in 2015 and 2016, did say that he wanted to end the war in Afghanistan. In fact, he very openly, almost every single rally he had, said that not only does he want to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, but he wants to ensure that the United States does not get involved in more unnecessary wars, right? And actually, till about 10 days ago, it seemed that he might actually be delivering on one of these campaign promises. Now, on September 7th, he tweeted in a series of tweets that that would no longer be the case. Now, I'll just put this up just as sort of one example of what he said. But basically, leading up to this, before this tweet, the United States has been meeting with the Taliban and with the Afghani government since last year. And they've had 9 rounds of peace talks in which this peace process has really been celebrated as going forward. But on September 7th, President Trump said that the deal was basically dead. And one of the reasons is because of this attack in Kabul that the Taliban took credit for. This was one of the many attacks that the Taliban have done in Kabul and beyond, but it claimed the life of a US serviceman. So in response, President Trump wrote in a series of tweets that basically he would not be inviting the Taliban to Camp David on September 11th to have a negotiation. And he also said if they cannot agree to a ceasefire during these very important peace talks and would even kill 12 innocent people, then they probably don't have the power to negotiate a meaningful agreement anyway. How many more decades are they willing to fight? Now, the thing is, I cannot tell you, right, when the war is going to end. I cannot even tell you if the war will ever end. But my goal this evening is twofold. First, what I mentioned, which is to discuss the bilateral relationship between the United States and Pakistan with you. But my other goal, which I hope really comes through, is that there are 2 wars that are going on. The global war on terror, which is sort of the larger overarching war, and the US war in Afghanistan, which not smaller, but is sort of a smaller war in the global war on terrorism. And both these wars have complicated Pakistan's position and has made Pakistan sort of between a rock and a hard place, in which Pakistan itself has done some domestic counterterrorism operations, which have led to some really questionable and controversial institutional developments. And for those of you taking notes, don't worry, I will get back to this too. I was one of those note takers, and I would hate it when somebody would just say something and not get back to it. So I will tie it in for those of you who have to write a paper. So going back to the US bilateral relationship with Pakistan. The United States, under the Trump administration, basically did continue on with the Obama administration's hardline approach. There are a series of things that the Trump administration has done. Some of them I've listed here. One of them that's really prominent is to reduce the security aid. And by that, there are 2 things that President Trump has reduced. One is foreign military financing. Now, foreign military financing is actually a grant program that numerous countries participate in. It's a grant that the US government gives to other countries so they can buy US arms. So the Trump administration has basically told Pakistan that they will no longer be receiving this grant, which would make it too expensive for Pakistan to buy any US arms. The second major security aid that they have cut is the coalition support funds, which is also a larger program in which the United States reimburses various countries for using their military bases. So in the case of Pakistan, because of the US involvement in Afghanistan, the United States has been using Pakistani air bases in the northwestern frontier province, which is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And so because they've been using them, the US has also been reimbursing Pakistan. Even under the Obama administration, the CSF was reduced. Even under George W. Bush, it was reduced. But under Trump, it has been sort of the largest reduction in these funds. Another thing that the United States has done really prominently is to lobby to get Pakistan on the Financial Action Task Force gray list. So the Financial Action Task Force is an intergovernmental agency, and it is essentially responsible for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. And the goal is that any country that finds itself on their gray list are those countries that have anti-money laundering frameworks, but those frameworks are weak, and so there are loopholes in there. So the goal is that if a country is put on this gray list for a time period, usually about a year or 15 months, it gives this country enough time to close the loopholes, right? To put some implementation in place, to write some new legislation, to create more capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So Pakistan was put on the gray list about a year and a half ago, and actually this is still very much an ongoing process. So last month, Pakistan submitted its report to the FATF about what it's done in terms of improving its anti-money laundering techniques and frameworks. But there are 2 things that the FATF and the United States is very worried about. One, of course, is how there are some very prominent leaders of very prominent militant groups that roam around freely in Pakistan, and Pakistan has not sort of arrested them or kept them arrested. And the second thing is some of these prominent leaders actually have non-governmental organizations. And the FATF is still very much worried about Pakistan not being able to control these NGOs that are run by militants. So those are sort of the two main points that deal with the FATF. The United States has actually lobbied very heavily with India to get Pakistan on this gray list, and India especially wants Pakistan to be on the black list, which would be even more severe sanctions. So this is sort of the environment Pakistan's anti-money laundering frameworks essentially are dealing with. The third thing that the Trump administration has done is to reduce military-to-military engagement. Now, this military-to-military engagement, for some, was even considered to be the hallmark between the United States and Pakistan. I mean, generally, the United States and the Pakistani militaries have gotten along. Hundreds of Pakistani officers have come to the United States and various military institutions to take classes, to get trained, to even complete degrees, and American officials have also gone to Pakistan to get a better handle of how the country works there. So this was something that was almost benign. A lot of people, even at times in the Obama administration or in the G.W. Bush administration, not G.W. Bush, well, sort of G.W. Bush, but George W. Bush administration were fine with Pakistan being a part of this. But last year, the Trump administration suspended 66 Pakistani officials from the International Military Education and Training Program. And this has not been renewed. So it's been 2 programs now, 2018 and now 2019, where Pakistani officials have sort of been ignored or not been included. Now, I would say that one of the main problems, right, with US and Pakistan, and at least the one main thing that the Trump administration is hoping to do by doing all of these things and other things, is that if they sanction Pakistan, if they limit security and military aid, somehow Pakistan will stop sponsoring militant groups, right? And the Trump administration, like I mentioned before, is not the only administration to have this idea, right? Yet Pakistan is still accused of sponsoring militant groups, and Pakistan still sponsors and harbors militants. So then the main question, right, that plagues this relationship is this: why does Pakistan sponsor militant groups, right? So there are 2 arguments for this. One is, which is used very commonly, which is that Pakistan has a civil-military imbalance. Now, like most developing countries, Pakistan has a civil-military imbalance, which doesn't make it unique. But Pakistan has been independent now for 71 years. And it has spent about more than half of its life under military rule because it has experienced 4 coups. Because of these coups, the Pakistani military has evolved into a very unique organization. So in many ways, it's a typical army. It's professional, it protects the country's borders, and it's a merit-based organization where it doesn't matter who your family is, what your economic background is. If you enter into the military and you do well, you can rise up, right? But the problem is also, I wouldn't say problem, but one of the interesting developments of the Pakistani military has been that it actually has business interests. So for example, the Pakistani army owns farms, fisheries, pharmaceutical companies. They run vocational training centers, right? The Pakistani army makes cereal and cheese. It's delicious, but they make cereal and cheese, right? And it's not just the army that is involved in these kinds of endeavors. The Pakistani Navy owns the Shaheen Foundation, which is a really large business conglomerate and has a great deal of real estate interests. Similarly, the Pakistani Navy owns the Bahariya Foundation, which has similar interests in farms, fisheries, pharmaceutical companies. They also own universities, etc. So collectively, the armed forces are kind of unique, and they are really embedded in Pakistani society and really in the fabric of society, right? So that in of itself has created a civil-military imbalance because the military is just so strong, and they have injected themselves in civilian life. But another reason why there is a civil-military balance is because of the United States. Now, traditionally, the United States has preferred to deal with the Pakistani military because of what I said earlier. They are professional, and they're merit-based, and they're efficient, and they get the job done. And also they were in power for about 35 years, so they sort of were the main agents that US officials could engage with. But because the United States has been so embedded with the US military, or at least in making policy with them regards to regionally, it's aggravated the imbalance. And this is really a byproduct of the Cold War. So I won't go into too much history. Obviously, this is not a history lecture, and the Cold War has been long over. But I will say very briefly that in 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States and Saudi Arabia actually created anti-Soviet forces, right? And these anti-Soviet forces were basically militant groups, non-state actors. These militant groups called themselves the Mujahideen. Right? The Mujahideen, their main goal was to fight the Soviets because they were communist, and the Mujahideen felt that they were waging jihad, which in Islamic terms means they're waging a struggle against these foreign occupiers, right? And these foreign occupiers who happen to be non-Muslim. So the US, there's now ample evidence showing this to us. But the US funded the Mujahideen, and they used the Pakistani army to do so, and the Pakistani army essentially trained these Mujahideen. Now, when the Cold War ended, Pakistan and Afghanistan found itself with a bunch of militants who were really well armed, really well trained, and essentially unemployed, right? Because the Cold War ended and the US left and sort of gone. Obviously, it's very simplistic, but just to sort of move forward, if we fast forward to 2019, now you're in a position where there are very prominent militant groups in Pakistan. Pakistan is known to support and aid the Afghani Taliban, which is not formally designated as a terrorist organization, but is viewed by the international community as a terrorist organization. It also sponsors, aids, and abets the Haqqani Network, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization according to the US Department of State. It also, the Pakistani military also aids and abets those militant groups that are attacking the Indian army in Indian-administered Kashmir. So groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba that did the 2008 Mumbai attacks, groups like Harkatul Mujahideen, groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a lot of these sort of groups, and I always call them the alphabet soup of groups because they also change their names too all the time, which is really hard when you're doing research on them. But essentially, Pakistan is accused for sponsoring. Now, some of you might be wondering, what does sponsorship really mean, right? So by sponsorship, I mean that they give them ammunition. On occasion, they train them operationally. They turn a blind eye to any criminal activity. A lot of these groups are involved in like the illegal drug trade or even in human trafficking. And they also sort of, turn a blind eye to their whereabouts, and they don't arrest sort of prominent leaders when given the chance. So that's sort of what I mean by sponsorship. So this is sort of the civil-military imbalance argument, right? That Pakistan has a civil-military imbalance, and the military is strong, the civilian side is weak, and if the civilian side was strong, somehow Pakistan would no longer sponsor militant groups, right? Now, the thing is, Pakistan does have a civilian side. I mean, it's a country that has its problems. It's a developing country. It's also a country that's transitioning democratically, but it has institutions. Now, in terms of counterterrorism, they are weak civilian institutions, right? But they do exist. And by institutions, I'm referring to these three institutions. So Pakistan actually has 17 laws that deal with terrorism, that define what terrorism is, why it's illegal, how people should be punished, how people should be tried, how long they should be detained, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these laws date back to colonial times. Some of these laws are sort of a result of the global war on terror, but they do exist. And one of the main ones is the Antiterrorism Act of 1997, or the ATA. Another one that is used very heavily is called the Aid to Civil Powers Act of 2011. And another one is the Protection of Pakistan Act. All of these laws collectively work together to define legally, in legal terms, what Pakistan's counterterrorism looks like, right? Another thing that exists in sort of this bureaucracy, right, are specialized courts. Now, Pakistan has anti-terrorism courts. Nobody can tell you how many there are. So when I did fieldwork in 2015, there were 59, according to one source I had. And according to another one, there were 10, which was obviously false. And then according to another one, there were 70. So these anti-terrorism courts, they vary. Every province has a different number of courts. They're sort of deregulated, but they do exist. And the Antiterrorism Act sort of laid out the formation of anti-terrorism courts. Anti-terrorism courts are these courts where if you are charged with an act of terrorism or you are charged under the Antiterrorism Act, your case goes to this court. And of course, you need the police too. And so the police also has specialized units, some that investigate. The CTD stands for the Counterterrorism Department, which is a specific department designed just for those who are charged with terrorism or just to investigate terrorist activities, right? So, and this is just really like a 3-minute spiel on this bureaucracy. Imagine doing research on this bureaucracy, right? I mean, states love bureaucracy. Pakistan is no exception. So, and to me, the puzzle was, well, okay, I get it. There's a civil-military imbalance. I also get that there's civilian institutions and they're weak. But why is it that even though Pakistan has such a strong bureaucracy, and there is so much of bureaucracy, why does it continue to sponsor militant groups? And that was sort of the puzzle that led me to do field work in Pakistan. I won't give you too much details about my dissertation, but I will say this, that doing fieldwork was really fun, and I had some good experiences, which I will be happy to talk about in the Q&A. But one of the main puzzles that I wanted to get to, right, was that why is Pakistan accused of sponsoring militant groups when Pakistan has all these counterterrorism agencies and laws in place? So the thing about doing research in Pakistan, or the thing about doing this kind of research in general, is you can't go to somebody and ask that, right? So I can't go to a police officer and say, so tell me, why don't you catch terrorists, right? Because obviously that interview would be done in a minute, right? So I had to be really creative about how I structured my questions and how I thought about also what terrorism means for the Pakistani state. So in this realm, I looked at the laws, and I looked at the courts, and I also looked at the police. And so there are certain trends that I found. So when I looked at these 17 anti-terrorism laws, the 3 trends I found was that all of these laws, anytime there was an attack in Pakistan, a sort of a large terrorist attack, or even sometimes a relatively small one. Not that any attack is small when it claims human life, but sort of in the grand scheme of numbers, when lawmakers would get together, anytime they created a law, they would always expand executive power, right? And they would not only just expand executive power, but they would also create these parallel court systems, and all of this was tied into political parties. Now first, I'll back up a little bit of what do I mean by executive powers. By executive powers, I essentially mean the powers that are given to law enforcement agencies, right? Now, Pakistan's anti-terrorism laws, these trends, they're not necessarily unique just to Pakistan. Actually, after the global war on terror, a lot of countries changed their laws. And you would think that there are a lot of South Asian or Middle Eastern countries who did so, but that's not really the case. A lot of European countries did so. And I'm going to refer to my notes so I don't get anything wrong. But, for example, Germany. Okay. Yeah, so Germany actually expanded the jurisdiction of its law enforcement agencies. They also allowed for religious groups to be banned, and if a religious group was about to incite violence, they could preemptively arrest them. German authorities can also detain somebody who is suspected of a terrorist act indefinitely. This is also the case in Australia. This is also the case in Chile, in Argentina, and in Brazil. And in fact, in the UK, they can be detained and they can even be tried without being formally charged. And all of this is sort of, in the name of terrorism, if you've been charged with terrorism. And in the sense of the creation of parallel judicial systems, by this I mean, specialized courts. So as I mentioned, Pakistan has these specialized anti-terrorism courts. So if you're charged with terrorism, you don't go through the regular criminal justice system, you go through the anti-terrorism courts, right? This kind of system exists in Brazil, and it also exists in Chile, mainly in the form of military courts, which also exist in Pakistan. But this is just to highlight that because of the global war on terror, there was a large push suddenly to make sure that an attack like 9/11 doesn't happen again, not just in the United States, but also in other countries. And when the US Congress passed the Patriot Act, a lot of countries copied that Patriot Act. So the Pakistan's Protection of Pakistan Act is actually almost verbatim the Patriot Act. If you looked at German laws, Australian laws, they all sort of have the language that share the Patriot Act. Of the US. And also, even the United States has expanded a great deal of executive powers. If you are considered an enemy combatant, you can be detained for as long as needed, which is in a way a gross violation of human rights. So just to reiterate a little bit, expanding executive powers, creating another court system. In that way, Pakistan is not unique, and it's followed the trend of Western European countries and even some other Latin American countries. But in terms of clientelistic political parties, this is where Pakistan is a little unique. Now, by clientelistic political parties, I mean that these are parties that more or less have militant wings. So there are about 15 national political parties in Pakistan. Almost all of them have militant wings. These militant wings are, sort of like violent student groups. They're very small. They have a very local agenda. They're not heavily armed or anything like that. But their strength lies in having a local network. So larger militant groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harkatul-Mujahideen, even Haqqani Network, etc., all of these want to tap into these militant wings because these militant wings have local knowledge, right? So this is where political parties, even though they are the ones in parliament creating the laws, and they're the ones who are expanding executive power, sometimes they are also the ones who write very vague language, right, to ensure that implementation is very difficult, which really restricts the police and the court system. Then moving on, I also looked at anti-terrorism case law. And because Pakistan has anti-terrorism courts, you would think it would be fairly simple, right? I could go to an anti-terrorism court, I could ask them for some numbers, I could potentially ask them for some case opinions, like the US Supreme Court here has opinions, online. Turns out that's not the case in Pakistan, and turns out it's a lot more deregulated than I initially thought. But I finally did manage to get, after 3 months of trying, all the case law pertaining to terrorism in Pakistan in 2015. And from that, the trends that emerged were that almost always higher courts, especially the Supreme Court or provincial high courts, any time an anti-terrorism act is sort of put in court saying it's unconstitutional, the high courts always say that, in fact, they are constitutional, right? And not only do they say that they're constitutional, but they also say that, executive power is, should be expanded because terrorism is such a heinous act. And they almost always prefer the right of the state over human rights, which I think for some, especially those who are interested in jurisprudence or judicial independence, would find really hard to sort of swallow, because for some, judiciary should serve the public rather than the state. But I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A too. And then looking at police trends in Pakistan, right? And this is, again, I'm talking about the civilian side, right, of counterterrorism in Pakistan. The police is really highly politicized in Pakistan, right? So this goes back into the clientelistic political parties. A lot of politicians treat the police as their personal bodyguards. So for example, I had one police officer tell me, I have 2 cars, right? 2 cars. And almost always there's one car that goes to the Minister of National Assembly's house because his daughter is in town from the US, and one of my superintendents has to drive her around, right? And this is a true story, and he told me with a straight face, and he said, you tell me, when a police car is called, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to tell the minister I can't drive his daughter around? I mean, I want to say yes, but I understand his position, right? It's a really difficult position to be in. So the police is highly politicized. The politicians misuse and abuse the police all the time. But even within the police, there are issues when it comes to counterterrorism. So of course, one of the responsibilities of the police, of any police or domestic law enforcement agency, is to investigate, right? In Pakistan, there's a great deal of lack of forensics training. Not only that, but they're parallel investigative agencies. So if a crime happens, it's not just your local police who's investigating it. Sometimes paramilitary forces are investigating it, right, which creates a tension between the civil and military institutions. And sometimes you have public-private organizations that are investigating it, which creates a whole other slew of problems when it comes to who did it, right, and what information exists for the investigation. Another thing that the police has sort of done is that they have almost an inferiority complex when it comes to the military. So of course, like I mentioned before, the Pakistani military is very strong, right? And they have sort of embedded themselves in the fabric of Pakistani society, right? Because of that, the police, right, who is actually constitutionally in charge of domestic law enforcement, and you could say domestic counterterrorism, feels that it doesn't get its due, right? And because of that, the police also pushes lawmakers to militarize. They want more weapons, they want more cars, they want more goggles, they want all these things, and they almost want to copy the military. They actually, to some extent, want some material that is used to protect the border in neighborhoods because they feel like this is what they need. And then if they have this stuff, it would allow them to counter terrorism rather than the civilian leadership calling in the military. So sorry, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but this is just to basically sort of highlight, right, the complexity of Pakistan's position, right? So when we hear in the news, there's another militant and Pakistan continues to support militant groups, it's not that simple, right? It's a really complex problem. And to some extent, the civilian side, right, is trying to counter militancy in its borders. It's trying to counter various militant groups. But when you see these trends all together, right, there is one thing that's sort of common. The same people, the same politicians who say that they want to counter terrorism, who say that they feel that it's the military who supported the Mujahideen and not us, and therefore, we are better and, we should be democratically elected. In some ways, because of their misuse of the police and misuse of laws and misuse of the judicial system, they're actually complicit when it comes to sponsorship, directly and sometimes indirectly. So this was sort of my main aim of telling you about how the global war on terrorism has affected Pakistan. Now, you would ask, okay, that's great. Pakistan's complicated. That's wonderful. What should the United States do about it, right? Why is this the United States problem? Well, I would say for one thing, for the United States, I think it's absolutely essential that the U.S. foreign policy establishment understands its limitations. Now, the U.S. over decades sometimes cuts aid, sometimes gives aids, sometimes cuts weapons, sometimes gives weapons, right? This is always sort of a carrot and stick game that's going on in Washington, which to some extent is politics. But at the same time, the United States has to understand that it cannot change Pakistan's policy of militant sponsorship. Like all countries, Pakistan has a security calculus. And for Pakistan, right now, sponsoring militant groups is something that they feel they need to achieve their geostrategic interests. And to be honest, Pakistan is not the only country to use militant groups ever, right? And it's also currently not the only country that is using militant groups. So the Cold War, of course, was a trying time, but it created two things: deterrence, right? And it created this culture of guns for hire, where mercenaries could be hired to do certain activities because it gave the state plausible deniability. Now, just because the Cold War is over does not mean that these actions do not exist, that these policies do not exist. So Pakistan is not the only country to sponsor militant groups or to use violent non-state actors to meet certain needs that it has. Saudi Arabia uses militant groups, and Saudi Arabia actually is a really important ally for the United States for some. Iran sponsors militant groups, Russia, Venezuela, even the United States. So this is just all to say that Pakistan is not the only country to sponsor militant groups. I think the one thing that the United States can do to improve its bilateral relationship with Pakistan is to find a common ground, right? To not make militant sponsorship as like the highlight of their bilateral relationship, because that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And it hasn't been seen to be going anywhere for decades, right? It's not a short-term thing. So I think there are two special areas of common ground that can be found. One is to protect Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. As many of you know, Pakistan became a nuclear country in 1998. Many times, anytime there's an attack or there's some tension between the United States, you might see in the news media a lot of analysts saying, well, we don't want Pakistan's nuclear weapons to get in the hands of militant groups. I mean, to be completely honest, I think these nuclear weapons are very, very highly protected. They're not floating around anywhere. Though I think there was a story in the Atlantic once that pointed otherwise. But I think they've been secured since 2004. And essentially, fundamentally, I think it's both in the United States' interests and in Pakistan's interest to ensure that there are safeguards in place to protect this arsenal. And I think another area of interest or another common area would be, how to end the war in Afghanistan. Now, this is sort of where everything comes together, right? Now, you have the Trump administration, past administrations, accusing Pakistan of sponsoring militant groups. Not just sponsoring random militant groups, but sponsoring the Afghan Taliban, right? The very people who hosted Al-Qaeda, who did the 9/11 attacks, right? So the US tells Pakistan, you're sponsoring them still, you're hiding their leadership, you need to stop. You need to either give them up or you need to expel them from the country. Yet at the same time, anytime a peace process begins, where the US officials get together with the Afghan government or with the Taliban or any other stakeholder in the US war in Afghanistan, the US calls upon Pakistan and says, help us out a little bit with the Taliban, right? You have a relationship with them, you've had a relationship with them since the 1990s, help us bring them to the table to talk to the Afghan government, right? So in this way, Pakistan is kind of, between a rock and a hard place. It's supposed to attack the Taliban and get them out of the country, yet at the same time, they're supposed to bring Taliban to the table, right? So I do think that this is a really complex issue, and I'm obviously simplifying it, but there is some area for common ground where if the US and Pakistan decide on a common goal, they could potentially backtrack from that. And I think one of the main common goals is that the war should end and that US troops should leave Afghanistan and they should not stay there indefinitely. And I think this could be something that it's not just the US and Pakistan agree on, but other stakeholders, including Afghanistan, potentially could agree on as well. So even though President Trump has recently said that the peace process is dead, I don't think that's true. The peace process has started and restarted over the past 18 years, and I don't see this being as any different. But I do think that Pakistan potentially has an opportunity to improve its relationship with the United States. So just in summary of my talk, and I know I threw a lot out there at you guys, but just to conclude, I'll say, of course, the US-Pakistan relationship is complicated, like most bilateral relationships are. But the global war on terror has added unprecedented tensions in the relationship, not just at a bilateral level, but at a regional level, and even to a global level. Pakistan's own counterterrorism efforts have had some very adverse domestic effects. For example, I mentioned some counterinsurgency campaigns that Pakistan has done. Since 2009, Pakistan has been waging counterinsurgency campaigns in its tribal areas, where it has really arrested and detained and killed really thousands of its own citizens. And this has given rise to a movement in 2018 called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is basically Pakistan's version of Black Lives Matter, in which the Pashtun population, which is in the tribal areas that borders Afghanistan, basically say that they're racially profiled, they're the ones who are arrested, and they're the ones where, all these expanded executive powers, they're practiced on them. So, Pakistan has paid a price for being part of the global war on terror in the way that it's created its laws and in the way that it's implemented its anti-terrorism laws. And of course, just sort of as a note, I live in DC, so I have to add a little note about, US foreign policy. But, the US needs to sort of stop overestimating its ability to change states' behavior. It needs to stop looking at Pakistan as a country that it can change its behavior and instead focus on more attainable policy goals. So thank you very much for listening. I know I talk really fast when I'm nervous, but I hope that was okay. And I had to add go Owu, so I'm really proud of being a bishop, and thank you for welcoming me back.
All right, so yellow, yay, all right. Okay, welcome. As I promised, we have some time now for some Q&A. And I have a couple observations or comments, and I'll pass this over to Sahar. Normally we have a better thing here. So the question, I think a couple things. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that Pakistan itself has been a regular victim of terrorist attacks, right? You know, and that's something we don't necessarily fully follow over here. And the point that you made too, that I mean, there was a time when the Taliban were encroaching within like 60 miles of Lahore or something like that. And also the Pakistani military has made quite a lot of sacrifice in the Northwest Territories and whatnot. It must be, I would imagine, for sometimes for Pakistani officials, it would be frustrating, as you say, like, what are we supposed to do? We're either negotiating with them or we're killing them, right? But I also wonder, it doesn't sound like you think, two things about the Trump decision. It doesn't sound like you think that it's going to make that much difference to them if the U.S. isn't giving the military aid. And I kind of wonder about that. I mean, they are really quite dependent on that. That relates to another, so I'm kind of curious about that. A second question specifically about Pakistan is, we had another speaker here, TV Paul, who's Indian, who spoke about Pakistan, which was interesting. But he made the point that what we really ought to be doing with Pakistan is, you know, they need a more diversified economy. They need help with the education system. You know, they need major investments to help them become a player much more broadly in the global context than just stuck on, you know, what is this thing going on with the role of the military in society, and also the relationship with the U.S., because that would give them other options. You didn't talk quite as much about the impact of the relationship with India, but there is a strategic logic, whether we like it or not, doesn't really matter, that says Pakistan benefits from stability towards the north if the Taliban or whoever are providing it, that allows them to be liberated and free to be more concerned about what they see as the existential threat, which is India, right? So, so I guess that's three questions, and then a fourth while I'm at it. I'm sorry, I see she's wisely taking notes, as we usually do. The fourth thing is I was kind of curious. Okay, so I'm thinking about Donald Trump, right? He's got no problem with the general in charge of Egypt. He's got no problem with Turkey going, you know, where Turkey's gone. He's writing love letters with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, as far as I can tell. He really likes this guy in the Philippines, Duterte. He doesn't seem to have any problem with autocratic regimes. So why does he have a problem with Pakistan? You know, I mean, why not Egypt, but a problem with Pakistan? You know, I mean, Egypt's just got just as many problems with ISIS and other things, right? So why that? You know, why is Pakistan an outlier in his worldview? So that's a bundle.
Okay, well, these are great. So first, your question about, you know, U.S. military aid. Of course, the Pakistani military relies on it really heavily. And not only relies on it, but actually sort of counts on it as well. And so this is something that I think with President Trump cutting aid, it's been really interesting to see. I think because President Trump is so unpredictable, and because the Pakistani authorities don't really know how much aid is being cut, they're a little more okay with it. So in the past, when aid has been cut, it's always followed a lot of bureaucracy leading up to it, saying, we're going to cut aid now. And so the Pakistanis have been prepared. They've been able to have talking points. They've been able to produce data to say why aid should not be cut, right? With the Trump administration, you just find out things via Twitter. Right? And so I think for the Pakistanis now, they're beginning to realize that, you know, especially if President Trump is reelected, right? We need to come up with another strategy. Relying on US military aid may not be the way to go. And I think that's why they're cozying up more to China as well, in terms of that. And I think also just in general, the Pakistani military right now is, and this is more of like a domestic thing, but it's being run by a somewhat economically conservative Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, and I think he has prided himself in saying that we will no longer rely on US military aid. So some of that is, I think, a little political game going on. But also in terms of how much aid is being cut, the coalition support funds being cut, this is not the first time they've been cut, and this is something that Pakistan always knew because it's a reimbursement program. So once the US stops using certain bases, they're not going to get this money. The FMF, the foreign military funding, that's more of a problem because Pakistan wants to buy US military equipment because it's superior, but at the same time, Pakistan can now buy equipment from China too, especially considering that Pakistan has a better relationship with China right now. So there's some sort of geostrategic, geopolitical stuff going on in addition to that.
Well, that's also an important point, because if we pull back, there will be a vacuum, somebody's going to step in.
Right.
And China sounds like they're waiting.
I guess
Afghanistan, too.
Right.
I mean, in a weird way, if we leave Afghanistan, that's a problem for Pakistan, right? I mean, it's really interesting we're doing these Afghan reviews and whatnot, because you know, one of the things you kept hearing is we have to stay in Afghanistan to help prevent conflict between India and Pakistan. It's like, tell that to the American public, because I don't quite get that, right? But there is, I mean, there is a logic behind it.
Right, right. There's a logic behind it. There's a logic behind it. But I don't know if I necessarily always agree with that too, but I'll move on to your other questions. Maybe we can talk. So in terms of, you know, aiding the civilian side, yes, the U.S. has aided civilian institutions, has given a lot of money for education and training and health, etc. But it's a really small percentage of aid. And actually one of the main problems with this civilian aid, which always gets me, is that there is a lack of consistency in all of these aid programs. And there are a lot of US agencies who do aid. So there's US aid, there's the Department of Justice that has programs there. So for example, when I was interviewing anti-terrorism court judges, one judge said that, you know, we are being trained by the UN on how to actually, you know, judge terrorism cases properly. But the UN gives us a different set of rules. The Department of Justice, because they're helping the province of Punjab, they give us a different set of rules. And actually anti-terrorism courts in Sindh are operating differently. So there's actually there's a whole other bureaucracy of civilian aid that exists that sort of, you know, makes the matter even more complicated. But for our purposes and sort of for the grand scheme of things, when it comes to civilian aid, certainly I think if it was increased, it might help. But for the US GDP, it's such a small percentage. And there's so many inconsistencies in it, I feel like it just ends up going into a black hole. In terms of India and sort of Pakistan's existential crisis, yes, that exists. Pakistan is overly obsessed with India. This is something that has, you know, I would say plagued Pakistan's institutions all over. Anytime the US even looks towards India, like they had a nuclear deal under the Bush administration in 2005 about, you know, using nuclear power. Pakistan basically had a fit and said, you know, why doesn't Pakistan have a agreement with the United States when it comes to nuclear power? So the problem with this issue, I think, is that India is not always looking towards Pakistan, right? So Pakistan, to some extent, needs to move away a little bit from India because Pakistan has so many of its own problems. I don't really think that focusing too much on India helps Pakistan. In fact, I think it actually takes key resources and key political discourse away from Pakistanis who should be talking about other issues rather than what India is doing. Now, this does not pertain to all issues, and I don't mean this in terms of Kashmir. I don't mean this in terms of a migrant crisis that is currently going on in Assam and India. I don't mean that. Of course, there are things to talk about, but for the military, especially when you conduct field work in a country like Pakistan, the first thing they mention is that India wants to kill us. And I'm not necessarily sure if that is always the case, especially in terms of counterterrorism. Though, who knows? Modi is another Trump, so he might be unpredictable. I don't know. So in terms of autocratic regimes, for a second I couldn't read my own handwriting. So why is it that, you know, Trump has a problem with Pakistan and not anybody else. Or Saudi Arabia, absolutely. Trump has no problem with Saudi Arabia. Actually, the U.S. has no problem with Saudi Arabia or with Israel, right? Not that Israel is an autocratic regime, but they do some human rights violations. But essentially, Pakistan has become an outlier for Trump, and I think a lot of that might have to do with his base and because of 9/11. There's this sort of, I would say, myth, because there really is no evidence to show this. There is this myth that 9/11 can happen at any time, right? That Afghanistan is a safe haven where if the US leaves, suddenly there'll be a bunch of terrorists there that are going to attack the United States. That simply is just not true anymore. 9/11 was a fluke in terms of the kind of attack that it was and in terms of how events unfolded. And so I think because of 9/11, because to some extent how it happened and some of its politicization, Pakistan has become almost an outlier. Even though when you look at US foreign policy has supported anybody that meets or does its interests, right? So it's really good friends with Saudi Arabia. It's really good friends with Israel. It has been, to some extent, really good friends with Latin American dictators and other dictators. So I think this is a hypocrisy that exists in the foreign policy establishment.
All right, well, let's turn it on to the audience. Who's got a question? Right here in front.
Please do wait for the microphones. It's for people to hear questions as well as answers.
Hi, I just had a question on your presentation. You said about the militant groups that are in Pakistan. In July 2019, Prime Minister Imran Khan arrested Lashkar-e-Taiba's chairman, Hafiz Saeed, and he's still in jail. So does that mean that Pakistan is not supporting anti-militant groups right now? And another question, after 2014 Peshawar massacre in the army school, Pakistani army took a really bold step and killed almost all of the Talibans that were, or as in your position, you embarked Mujahideens. Pakistani army killed almost half or almost full of the Mujahideens that were in northern tribal areas. So does that make Pakistan anti-terrorism now? And does it support the US agenda over Pakistan's foreign policy? Thanks.
I think that's a great question. In terms of Hafiz Saeed, so Hafiz Saeed has been arrested numerous times, right? Sure. So Hafiz Saeed, he is the leader of this group called Jamaat ad-Dawa, which is actually the charitable wing of a militant group called Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba is a group that is essentially based in Pakistan, and it attacks Indian forces in Indian-administered Kashmir. So some of you may have heard of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which killed over 200 people. So Lashkar-e-Taiba was in charge of those attacks. They conducted those attacks. So Hafiz Saeed is the leader of their charitable wing, which is called Jamaat ad-Dawa, and he has been designated as a terrorist individual by the US Department of State and even by some European countries. Now, often, the thing about Hafiz Saeed, which I always find interesting, is that he roams around pretty freely in Pakistan. And he makes speeches, and on occasion he'll go on TV, and he's arrested a lot, and he's let go a lot. So right now he's currently arrested, but he was arrested in 2009. He was arrested in 2010. He was arrested, I believe, in 2013. So he's placed under house arrest. It's like a political thing of like, look, we arrested Hafiz Saeed. I mean, he's also not the only one, right? There's Masood Azhar, which is a group called Jaish-e-Mohammed. He leads that group. And Jaish-e-Mohammed is a group that also attacks Indian forces in Kashmir. Masood Azhar actually addresses political rallies, right? And he's a designated terrorist. So I think I think arresting Hafiz Saeed is it may show some political will, but it's also like an easy optic, right? Like, look, we've arrested him again. I think the key will be, does he remain arrested, right? And is he actually charged with things that he should be charged with, right? So I think that's something that Prime Minister Khan is going to struggle with, because eventually he's always let go for various pressures. And you're absolutely right. After there was a really horrific terrorist attack in Pakistan in December 2014 in the Army Public School in Peshawar that killed over 150 children and teachers. And after this attack, the Pakistani government, the civilian side, and the military establishment got together and they created the National Action Plan. The National Action Plan is a 20-point program in Pakistan that says that it will go after militants. It created military courts, so I mentioned the anti-terrorism courts. The government and military felt that these courts were not enough. And so anybody who is charged with terrorism, especially who's in charge of, who did these attacks, will go to the military courts. They sort of restarted the death penalty. They gave law enforcement agencies a great deal of power to detain, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a struggle that Pakistan has. It counters terrorist groups, but at the same time, because of some institutional weaknesses and because of lack of political will, it also lets some people go. I will say this, though, that I think overall, the civilian side, especially Imran Khan's government, is trying very hard to ensure that it counters militant groups. But I think the main problem is not simply how to counter them, but what to do with them. And Pakistan has waged so many counterinsurgency campaigns now that it's created a missing persons issue. So if you Google missing persons in Pakistan, you will really see horrific accounts of people who have been arrested and detained, and they have disappeared. Their wives, mothers, families don't know who they are, right? And they're probably rotting in some military jail because they're told that they're militants. So there's a huge problem with regards to this. And the army conflates numbers all the time. They'll say, we killed 1,000 Taliban. Okay, what was the evidence? How do you know that they were the Taliban? How do you know that they were anti-state? How do you know they were the ones who did any of these attacks? The army never has answers for these questions, which I think is a larger issue of how much power we should give and what the army is allowed, or even what law enforcement agencies are allowed to do in the name of counterterrorism. But overall, I do think Pakistan wants to counter militant groups, but a lot of it is because of some of the institutional problems it has.
Hi. Questions of justice and legality aside, do you think that the trends toward expanded executive power, parallel court systems, deprivation of rights, etc., has decreased the amount of terrorist attacks that we see? And can you give some examples as to why or why not?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I think, overall, I don't think that it's decreased the amount of terrorist attacks, and I'll tell you why. I think one of the reasons why terrorist attacks get so much attention is because they do happen relatively rarely. Even in the case of Pakistan, which experiences a lot more attacks than the United States, anytime an attack is labeled as terrorism, it becomes sort of media fodder, and people become more, obsessed with it. In terms of increasing executive power and all of these things, I think more than decreasing terrorism, what they've really done is violated human rights. They've violated the rights of the citizens of the country, where now you see movements, and especially minority communities who are targeted. You'll see sort of this idea that a whole community is responsible for the action of a few. Right? And that's sort of what I find troublesome when I see these trends, right? So in terms of Pakistan, the counterinsurgency campaign that the military has waged has gone after Pashtuns. And yes, it's true, perhaps some Pashtuns were part of the Taliban, but that does not mean, or it should not mean, that the army has a right to go inside Pashtun homes and arrest people for no reason and without any evidence. And I think one of the problematic things about laws like this is that the action comes before any proof. And I think that's sort of what's more troublesome in this aspect. As far as decreasing terrorist attacks, 9/11, as I said before, was a really rare event. And I think in the history of the United States, after Pearl Harbor, that was the other major attack that the U.S. has experienced. So especially in terms of the U.S., I think it's very hard to say if these laws, if the Patriot Act or even the authorization to use military force, etc., if these laws have decreased terrorism, because in U.S. history, such acts of terrorism have been pretty rare. I hope that answers your question.
So I have another follow-up on that. There's time for a couple more. But if you were called in, I don't know how I would do this, but if Donald Trump asked you to come give him a briefing,
Oh boy.
which could be interesting in and of itself. And he just is held out for leaving Afghanistan. It's not just Trump, because virtually every Democratic candidate too, except maybe Joe Biden was wavered a little bit on that. But they're saying we're out, we're gone, right? So there's no one's got a crystal ball, but given what you know, how would you game out what happens then? Let's say into 2020, U.S. has removed all its troops out of Afghanistan, which also means the NATO troops are going to go too, because they're not going to stay. They're not there. What happens? What happens to Afghanistan? What does Pakistan do? How does India react to that? How would you game that out if you were decision makers on whether they should make that call or not?
Sure.
But I should say, as for everyone, this is really America's longest war. It's very legitimate to want to be out of it. It's a very legitimate thing. But experts are saying we can't leave, because if we leave, it will fall apart. And of course, that's a classic thing that gains can often be made and then lost very quickly, right?
Right.
So anyway, I don't have the mic, so I'll turn it back to Sahar.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. I think what the question that we should ask ourselves is, what are we gaining by being there, right? Afghanistan is involved in a civil war. This civil war has been going on since the Taliban were ousted in 2001. And yeah, to some extent, NATO forces and US forces have helped stabilize, certain areas. But as it stands right now, the Taliban has the most land that it's ever had. It has control over the most land that it has ever had. The Afghani government is present, but it remains weak. I would say that it could probably still withstand, if the troops withdraw. But the Afghani National Security Forces are really weak, and they're depleted because they feel that they are no match when it comes to the Taliban. So I think what would happen if US troops withdrew, violence in Afghanistan would probably increase, and there's no doubt in my mind about that because of the ongoing civil war. But I do think they would actually get internal Afghani forces and Afghani actors to figure out a solution, something that works for them. Because right now what's happening is the Taliban is asking for two things. They have always asked for foreign troops to leave Afghanistan, and they've always said that they want the current Afghani government to dissolve because they view it as a puppet government, right? And so, in my view, if the US continues to stay, right, it continues to give Taliban this life of attacking, right? Because in their view, they're attacking a puppet government that doesn't belong. They're attacking foreign invaders that don't belong. Also, I think from the U.S. perspective, I think it's really important for the United States officials who are involved in this to really figure out what do they want, right? If every time I hear in D.C. about, we can't lose this war. We can't lose this war. Okay, but what does winning look like, right? Nobody has an answer for that because we don't really know what winning looks like, right? Does winning mean that Afghanistan becomes a democratic country? In that case, this is just, the beginning, does winning mean that Afghanistan becomes a stable government? Perhaps, you could argue a plan where US or NATO forces stay in the capacity for Afghan National Security Forces to give them some capacity building, right, and not in any political realm. Perhaps that could be something that's worked out. Does victory mean ending the Taliban? I thought that's what we were doing for the past 18 years, and the Taliban has only gotten stronger. So I think there's a real crisis in terms of, from the US perspective, what do we want in Afghanistan, right? And from Pakistan's perspective, Pakistan has been betting on the Taliban since the 1990s, right? So they may not like the Taliban, they may not fundamentally agree with a lot of things that the Taliban are doing, but if the Taliban happens to be in power in Afghanistan, Pakistan is hoping that as one of the only countries that has ever recognized the Taliban as a political entity, that it would mean that Afghanistan and Pakistan have a good relationship and that some of the border issues that they have might be resolved. But again, this is looking in a crystal ball, so it's really unclear. But unfortunately, it's a really complex and confusing situation with no easy solution.
All right, yes, right here. And we'll come over here. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so do you think that currently in the state of our government and 9/11 that there's more of a prejudice from Americans of Pakistan? Like, do you think, okay, let me rephrase it. Do you think that due to 9/11 and the current state of our government with Donald Trump being our president, that there is a prejudice against Pakistan and their people and that whole organization?
So, it's funny, I think we spoke about this a little bit. I came to school here in 2002, so it was right after 9/11. So first, but talking about the Trump administration, I don't think so. I don't think that there's any prejudice against Pakistani people. I don't think the prejudice is geared just towards Pakistanis, right? Let me put it that way. But, President Trump issued that travel ban and Pakistan was not on the list, so I suppose that's a good thing. So you could argue that perhaps, he's not prejudiced. It's hard to tell with the Trump administration exactly what dictates his policy choices, right? Because a lot of it is not driven by empirical evidence. And I would argue a lot of it is dictated by sort of a lot of myth making too. Just from my own personal experience, I personally have never experienced any prejudice by being Pakistani or Muslim. I might be rare. I do not speak for all Pakistanis or all Muslims, but I will say, working in DC in this current climate, nobody talks about Pakistan as a country that's been discriminated against, right? If nothing else, most people, and I say this because I'm in the Cato Institute, and so I'm plugged into sort of the libertarian side and even to some extent the conservative side, there's this idea that actually we've been too easy on Pakistan, right? Because we keep giving Pakistanis military and security aid, and they keep sponsoring militant groups. So if nothing else, there's a little bit of that going on.
It could be as simple, too, as Donald Trump sees things in transactional ways. And so this burden sharing notion, it's like he's attacking Germany as well, right? Because we're quote unquote giving them all this money, which actually isn't accurate, but not getting the return out of it that we would want, I guess. That's possible, too. Yeah. Someone else over here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Oh, she needs a mic. Yeah.
Okay, so as we saw in your presentation too, media plays a really large role in this, and I'm just talking about like foreign policy in general. Considering that the president used a social media platform to talk about foreign policy in a way as making a decision to the public, in what ways do you think, trying to think in a more positive way about it, could media and just media outlets in general benefit the way that foreign policy is handled and foreign policy is looked at? Obviously media has been showing it in a little bit more of a negative light with recent decisions and the recent tweets from President Trump, but what could we do better in that aspect to promote positive foreign policy changes through the social media and just media in general?
No, I think that's a great question. In terms of, I personally have no problem with social media. I think actually it's a great platform to, increase knowledge, to increase transparency, to even to demand accountability, right, from your government, either local or provincial or what have you. When it comes to President Trump tweeting, there's an issue there, mainly because he usually tweets without any of his advisors knowing, right? He also tweets sometimes, maybe often, he also tweets misinformation, right? And he also, in my view, sometimes uses Twitter as a way to bolster himself rather than bolstering America, even though his slogan is "Make America Great Again." But some of the actions that he does, a lot of people would argue actually counters that, right? So the problem is not that President Trump tweets, right? It's what he's tweeting that's problematic. Now, for example, in the tweets that I put up just of September 7th, right, which he tweeted that I was going to have a secret conversation with the Taliban leadership in Camp David. Nobody knew about it, but it's not happening anymore, and the deal is dead, sort of tweet, right? To me, this kind of tweet, it just seems odd coming from a president, right? I mean, you're not the head of the PTA, right? You're the president of a country. This is a huge national security issue, which has claimed thousands of lives. And I'm actually in favor of negotiating with the Taliban because I personally think the war should end. But these kinds of tweets, I feel like, take the discourse away from something that's important, right? We end up talking about what Trump tweeted and when he tweeted rather than the substance sometimes of what's going on. So in this aspect, instead of actually talking about why is it that the Taliban did this attack, why is it that the Taliban wanted to come to Camp David and the US actually backtracked, instead of talking about those things, right? Why was Camp David chosen? Instead of talking about those things, we're talking about the fact that the president tweeted this. So I think that's kind of frustrating, because or maybe it's like a DC thing, but it's like every morning everybody just talks about what the president tweeted and not necessarily what the substance is. But in terms of using, I think, social media, I think it's a great resource for everybody involved, not just leaders, but I think really every single person. If you especially want to hold your government accountable, you want to ask serious questions of your government, of your representatives, I think social media is the way to do it. It's the new tool to be in your favor.
So I have a closing question and comment, but I see a few hands. So let's do three in sequence, actually, these three here. I'll get the questions, and then I'll have a response. So try to keep them brief so we can keep moving.
Okay. Do you have a sense of Pakistani public opinion about militant groups, and does India's actions in Kashmir affect that?
There were two others right here, and then one more in back, I believe.
So in your opinion, just how effective is the allocation of funds that are given through U.S. financing? Because it seems to me like everything is so localized in Pakistan that maybe it's subject to clientelistic or militant interests. So just wondering on that.
So the way I understand your foreign policy bilateral relationship repairing, it's sort of like this realpolitik Kissinger-esque style. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. But what do you see as the ultimate end goal of pursuing a more diplomatic forward resolution of this problem?
You mean the resolution of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, or the
2 points you mentioned right before you nuclear.
Oh, God, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so first about Pakistani public opinion. The Pew Research Institute actually did a public opinion poll a few years ago, and Pakistanis are generally very anti-militant groups, and they feel that, the military especially has sort of misused militant groups, and if nothing else, Pakistanis have been more victims of terrorism than anybody else, and they really want to solve this issue. And to some extent, they are in favor, even of sometimes the military coming in to solve domestic law enforcement issues. In terms of Kashmir, I mean, there is definitely, groups in Pakistan who believe that Kashmir belongs to Pakistan. So what the current tensions that are going on now has certainly skewed public opinion. For now, it's hard for me to tell if that public opinion is saying that, we should have militant groups. I don't think that that's what the Pakistani public wants. But what I think what the Pakistani public wants is for the international community to pay more attention to Kashmir and to hold Indian forces more accountable for the gross human rights abuses that they've done there. But I don't think that's the Pakistani public saying we should support non-state actors. But that would be an interesting poll to do. your question about, everything being so localized, even the aid, and how would the aid help, right, for localization? Well, I think actually most of civilian aid that has gone to improving or bolstering infrastructure is very localized, right? And in fact, one of the grievances that a lot of people, a lot of anti-terrorism court judges and lawyers had is that we get all this aid to do general things, but they don't meet specific needs. So for example, like the anti-terrorism courts in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, their main problem really has been, the distance, right? Really the distance between the people who are detained, because they're detained in secret locations, and whether or not they should be appeared in court, right? So I actually had one judge say that we actually need armored cars to take these militants from their detention center into the court so they can appear in court and be tried. But we don't have these armored cars. And because of that, our system is backlogged. So we actually need US aid to give us money for cars, right? But instead, they'll give us money on training lawyers and going to the UN, right? So I don't think the problem is localized. I think the problem is that when aid packages are given, they have more general guiding principles, and they're not localized enough. I think if they were localized enough, perhaps we could actually see more money being used rather than being misused, right? And then to your question about, finding foreign policy grounds, and whether or not, the U.S. and Pakistan can find common grounds. I think in addition to, the nuclear weapon issue, and in addition to Afghanistan being solved, it is always frustrating to hear the U.S. say, well, Pakistan is just like that. It just sponsors militant groups. It's just, something that it does, which, to some extent might be true. But I think that for the United States, if the US has an interest in the region, Pakistan is a main player in the South Asian region, right? It can certainly find many areas of common interests. For example, water security is becoming a huge issue. The US and Pakistan can certainly find itself aligned when it comes to ensuring that water is dealt with, the water scarcity issues are dealt with. Urban planning could be something that they, agree on. And I say this in respect to foreign policy because a lot of foreign policy issues, of course, they're national security issues. But I think in Pakistan, because the focus becomes so much on national security and sponsorship, some other really important areas that might, fuel grievances get ignored. So there would be certain, I think, other areas of common interest as well that they could find. But I do think the U.S. needs to sort of get over Pakistan's militant sponsorship, which I realize is a really controversial thing to say. But, using militant proxy groups is something, Pakistan is not the only country to do it. And it's a strategy that's been used by numerous countries, and it's a strategy that's going to continue to be used because it's almost part of our geostrategic framework in the international world.
All right, so let me ask one final question. First of all, one comment. It does seem like there's some things Pakistan could do also, for example, allowing some access to AQCon or something like that. I mean, to build some confidence with the U.S. intelligence community and whatnot, too. That's a problem domestically, politically at home, too, because he's a hero of the nation, right? The AQCon was the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb. Anyway, the U.S. would like to talk to him. And he's in house arrest, which means he's...
House arrest because he created a network of illicit nuclear trading, not
yes,
because he made the bomb.
That's right.
Not for Pakistan, but because he actually traded illegally.
Yes.
And the Pakistani government says that they didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Which I find a little...
That would be hard. Well, they also say they didn't know Osama bin Laden was hiding in their country also. But that also seems kind of improbable, and probably we knew also. Who knows? We don't know. But my question is actually a little bit more about your visit back to Ohio Wesleyan. So often I'll ask speakers, what kind of advice do you have for students today? I mean, what are the things they can be doing right now if they're interested in seeing what you're doing? And I think it's really important to note that one of the reasons we're so excited that Sahar is here is that Ohio Wesleyan has a very long history that goes back a over a century of students from Pakistan coming here, and India as well. And one of the things I've always noticed when they're here is they tend to see their commonalities more than their differences. It's like with my Irish and English friends too, sometimes that happens. And I saw that when you were here and with your friends and whatnot. So what kind of things did you take away from here that help inform what you do? And just briefly, as you think about it, what kind of advice would you offer an undergraduate right now who's thinking, wow, that's pretty cool, I'd love to do that kind of thing and be involved and have leaders listen to me and things like that? So we'll give you a mic to answer that question.
So yeah, I would say for one thing, I think Ohio Wesleyan, or really college in general, is a great place where one can open their mind, right? I mean, this is the place where you are operating alone. You're away from your family, your friends, your home. And this is really the place where you can meet people who are different from you. You can meet people who have a different way of thinking than you. And this is a really good chance to sort of ask them questions and to build friendships. Two of my closest friends were Indian. And we actually, when I was here especially, there were about 75, I think, Indian and Pakistani students. And there was a World Cup match that we saw in 2003. And, we saw it in this big house. And we were all together and we were all celebrating. Pakistanis not so much because we lost. But basically, we all got together and we would go out and eat together and celebrate various holidays together like Diwali and Eid, etc. So I would say, for one thing, take advantage of the fact that you are in a community like Ohio Wesleyan, which is very diverse. And this diversity is really a gift. You may not see it, and Delaware, I'll admit, is not the most exciting place all the time to be. But that said, the community at Ohio Wesleyan is really unique. And I'm not just saying this because I'm here and I was invited back, but I really enjoyed my time here. I made lifelong friendships, and I really felt that my mind opened up here. And that's why Ohio Wesleyan has such a special place in my heart. And I would say that, this is also the opportunity to take classes that you wouldn't ordinarily take. This is the opportunity to talk to foreign students. Like, I had never met somebody from Cyprus before, ever. I mean, I lived in Pakistan, and nobody's from Cyprus apparently ever visits Pakistan. But, I had 3 or 4 classmates who are from Cyprus, and we're still friends to this day. So I think it's a great opportunity to open your mind. In terms of just career advice, I would say this sort of regular study hard. But, I do think that it's important to pay attention to what you're studying and to be really dedicated to your studies as well. Now sort of, as an adult, as a mother, there's so many opportunities. I don't really sometimes get time to sit and read a book that I really want to read, right? I'm always speed reading because I have a 5-year-old and a 7-month-old. But, this time, college, you are really privileged to be here. This is a time where you can read, you can watch movies, you can make friends. So really take advantage of that. And especially in the political environment that we are currently in, I think Ohio Wesleyan really is like an oasis where you can really open your eyes. And, if you really want to party, I guess you could go to Columbus, only if you're 21. But I would definitely say, this is the time to open your mind, because this time that you have is a gift, and you should really, really take advantage of it. And I wish you the greatest success. I mean, Ohio Wesleyan has been great for me. I think the mentorship that I got from Sean Kay, from Professor Alice Simon in economics, from various professors who have retired now. Professor Esler, actually, I love constitutional law because of him. I mean, these really matter. I still have notes from my class. I can't read my handwriting, but I have my notes. So this is really the time. When you look back on this, you will think of the classes you took, and it will really define the way you think, the friendships you make, and the career paths you take.